Hello. So now I'd like to continue with our introduction to SketchUp by talking about some of the tools that are available in our large tool set. First and foremost, the thing I'd like to discuss is the navigation around our 3D space. So using 3D software for the first time can be a little disorienting, so it's helpful to get a good foundation of how to move around a three-dimensional scene. So the tools that we need to use in order to do that in SketchUp are available over here. And the first one I'd like to talk about is the Orbit tool. And this tool, when we select it and then left click and move our mouse around, you can see that we are able to spin around and go up and down and all over the place, or as they call it, we can orbit around our scene relatively easily. Now, this is a good tool, but there's going to be many situations where you're in the middle of, an operation. Maybe you're selecting something or drawing a square or a circle or some other operation, and you don't want to interrupt that by coming over and clicking on the Orbit tool. So SketchUp is actually set up to allow for easy navigation using simply your mouse. So if you are using a laptop that has a trackpad on it, I highly recommend that you purchase an inexpensive 2-button mouse with a scroll wheel. And the reason for that is the navigation tools are directly linked automatically when you open up SketchUp to your mouse. So for example, the Orbit tool is actually the scroll wheel. When you push the wheel down and hold it down, this tool automatically engages. So if I'll demonstrate here by using a different tool from the tool palette, and now just by pushing my mouse wheel down, you can see that the cursor will change to my Orbit icon, and then I can again move my mouse around to orbit around my scene, okay, without changing. And when I let go of the wheel, it instantly goes back to the tool that I'd already been using. Okay, so get used to using a mouse wheel in order to orbit around your scene. Now, while we're talking about the wheel on the mouse, the Orbit tool we activate by holding the wheel down. Now, if I were to also engage the Shift key on my keyboard, you can see that my cursor changes to the hand, which is the pan tool. So I'm allowed to kind of move the scene. I'm not orbiting in this case, I'm just sort of moving the location of where my scene is by holding down the Shift key and the mouse wheel, and then moving my mouse around as I need to. So that's a very important thing to try to get coordinated doing to help you. So if I were to orbit around and then somehow I get off center with my orbiting, if I wanted to then shift it over to the left or to the right by holding the Shift key down and the mouse wheel, I can pan the scene. Okay. The next tool that I want to discuss is the Zoom tool. Okay, so I can click on the toolbar and get the magnifying lens, which is the Zoom tool. So by clicking the mouse and then rolling my mouse around back and forth, I can zoom in or zoom out. At the same time, what's easier to do even than that is to just roll your wheel back and forth, and you can zoom in easily without having to select the tool from the toolbar. So that's a much easier way to do that, and in combination with the scroll wheel and using it as the orbiter and then just rolling the wheel in and out, you can see how you could quickly navigate around a scene. I want to add a couple of objects just to help us understand our orientation a little bit better. So I'll just quickly draw a couple of items so that when we orbit around, we can see in a much better way how we're navigating around the scene And if I roll the wheel in and out, you can see that I am indeed zooming closer or further based on the direction I roll my wheel. One other thing I want to point out about the zooming with the wheel is wherever your cursor happens to be becomes the focus or the center of that zoom. So in other words, if my cursor is hovering over this rectangular object here and I roll the wheel in and out, you can see that my zoom is focused over there. Whereas if I move my mouse over to the cylinder here and I roll the wheel back and forth, I'm focused on that part of the drawing. So I can literally do that by just moving my cursor over to a certain location in the scene. So when you have a large complex scene, you can zoom out and quickly zoom in on a different part of the scene by just holding your cursor or moving your cursor to that location. Okay, so the zooming about the cursor is very helpful for you to keep in mind. The next tool beside the zoom or magnifying lens is the zoom window, and as the name suggests, this one you click and draw a window around the object you want to zoom in on, or the part of the drawing that you want to focus on, just by drawing a window, and then it'll take you there. There is no keyboard shortcut by default set up for that function, and activating it with the mouse doesn't seem to have a shortcut as well. The next thing I want to point out is the zoom extents. So the zoom extents button is a very useful tool. It's basically you just click on the tool and it does its job. You don't actually have to do anything other than clicking on the tool. And what this does is by clicking here, it will automatically focus the entire scene to fit all of your objects into the window. So no matter how large the scene is, so if I were to draw something way over here, I'll just quickly draw an object over here. If I were to now click on the zoom extents, it will include that object in my scene, regardless of the zooming or orbiting direction. So however you want to see the scene, just by clicking on this icon, it will get everything that's into your scene quickly. So that's a very handy way of knowing that you might have accidentally moved something out of the window where you were working, and now you're having trouble finding it. So by clicking on this button, it will pan out or zoom out to include all of the objects that are currently in your scene. And last but not least, the icon next to the zoom extents is called the previous. What this does is it takes you back to, it's like a step back in the last scene setups that you had done. So it's a little bit like an undo, but only for your view angles. So if you change your views and you go back, it'll keep taking you back step by step to a number of previous views. So that can be handy sometimes if you are trying to set a view or a camera position and you accidentally shift something. If you click on that, it'll take you back to the last scene you were looking at. So that pretty much covers the navigation tools in SketchUp. Now the next set of tools that I would like to discuss are the drawing tools. So if I were to clean this scene up a little bit, get rid of these objects, I'll leave our guy in there for now just to help us be oriented a little bit better. So the first tool looks like a pencil. This tool, it seems very simple, and it is. This tool draws lines, and strangely enough, the most important thing you can do in SketchUp is draw lines. So if we use this to just click around our scene, you can see that I'm quickly drawing lines. But what's different in this case from what we're used to is because we're looking at this in a three-dimensional space, what we think we've drawn isn't always what we've drawn. So if I were to now orbit this view a little bit, you will see that indeed some of my lines were drawn in the third dimension, but it didn't look like that when I was drawing it. So in order to avoid this happening while we're drawing, I recommend getting into a two-dimensional view of your space. So for example, if I'm trying to draw the outline of a building, I'm better off moving into a top view, and that way I can easily or be confident that I'm drawing things in 2 dimensions. So now if I were to quickly draw a series of lines, I can be fairly confident that indeed I'm drawing in 2 dimensions. Another way that I know that is if I make the object a closed surface, the face between all of the lines, if I make it a closed polygon, becomes filled in. And this is something that SketchUp does automatically to let you know that you have now completed an object in a single plane and turned it into a surface. So the whole way that SketchUp understands objects are from edges and surfaces. So in order for us to know that we've drawn a rectangle, SketchUp basically sees 4 edges or 4 lines that have closed and are all at perpendicular angles, so that just creates a rectangle. And which takes me to our next tool, the rectangle tool. So as the name implies, if we want to draw rectangular objects, this tool is the easiest way to do that, rather than drawing 4 separate lines with our line tool. And that way we know our corners will always be perpendicular, and we can then create the object however we wish. Now if you'll notice down in the bottom right corner, the object I just drew, the size of it is displayed down to the precision that I currently have my model set up to, which is, I believe, 1/16 of an inch is the smallest factor that I've got. Now if I know the exact size of the rectangle that I wanted to draw, for example, I just drew this rectangle and it says it's 15 feet 1 5/16 inches by 23 feet 3 1/4. If I know I needed that rectangle to be, for example, 12 feet by 24 feet, as long as I don't move on to the next operation, I can just enter that information directly from my keyboard right now. So if I type 12 and then the foot symbol, comma 24 feet, and then hit return, it will resize that rectangle to the dimensions that I've typed in. If I've got that backwards and it's supposed to be 24 feet, comma by 12 feet, I can once again retype that. Okay, so I can keep doing this until I start another operation. Okay, so this feedback box over here is really critical for us to understand exactly what we are putting into our model. In the beginning, if we're just doing some rough designing, we don't need to worry too much about that, other than keeping an eye on it and saying, oh, okay, I need something that's approximately 8 feet by 5 feet. So if I can zoom into something like that, and then I can adjust it later, or right now if I want to, 8 feet, comma 5 feet, and then I have the exact dimensions for that rectangle. The rotated rectangle tool directly beside the rectangle tool, in my experiences, I can't say I've ever used it a whole lot, and I don't necessarily want to dissuade you from using it, but it's just one of those tools that I don't find all that useful. Similarly, the freehand tool I also don't find particularly useful, because there's no way of controlling exactly what you're drawing other than how you move your mouse around. But I guess there might be a situation for drawing something like contour lines on a surface or something along those lines, but by and large, again, freehand lines in design are usually not encouraged. So these two tools I find less than useful. Okay. The next tool is the circle tool, and as the name implies, if you were to click and drag it out, you can see that the radius is given in the bottom right hand corner. And again, if I know what that radius is supposed to be, for example 3 feet, I can type it right now and hit enter, and the circle will be drawn with exactly a 3-foot radius. Now the default circle in SketchUp, as you can see, as I zoom in on it, I can see that it's actually not curved lines. It's a grouping of smaller segments to represent a circle. So the default setting is to draw a circle with 24 sides. So if I draw another one and click, if I want to make it smoother, I need to increase the number of sides. So if the default's 24, let's say I type in something like 60, as long as I follow that with an S to designate sides, and I hit return, it will smooth that circle out into much smaller segments. And you can see that these edges here represent that parameter. So you can always adjust the smoothness or the roundness of your circle by increasing or decreasing the number of sides that you might want it to be drawn with. Okay. The next tool beside the circle tool is the Polygon tool. Now the Polygon tool is very similar to the circle tool in a way, because we start by clicking the center point of it and then we drag it out to whatever size we need it to be. Now the default setting for the Polygon tool is a hexagon or 6-sided figure, and if you want to change that, once again you would type the number of sides. So if I wanted a triangle, I would type 3s and hit enter. Now you might be wondering, well, how is that different than if I drew a circle with 3 sides, which isn't much of a circle anymore. But again, if I type 3s, oh look, I get a triangle. So in a way, these two tools are basically the same tool, other than the default setting. This one is 24-sided polygon and this one is a 6-sided polygon, but more or less they do the same function. Okay, so that covers our object drawing, and the last 4 tools here are for drawing various types of arcs or partial curves, or whatever you want to call them. Each of them draws an arc in a different way, and the most common one that you will likely use is the 2-point arc. And the way you use it is by clicking a start point of one end of the arc, the other end of the arc, and then you push the mouse out to define the curvature of that arc, and then it fills it in if it happens to be connected to a side. If it's just out in space and you draw an arc in that way, then it's not going to create a surface because it doesn't have a closed polygon. If I want to close it, all I need to do is draw a line between the endpoints, and there I've got my partial, or it's not quite a semicircle, but an arc that's been filled in. The other types of arcs are helpful if you're trying to draw a sweep of a certain angle. So like, for example, a door sweep that you want to have open at 90 degrees, you can click and then drag it open, and that would give us a arc that has been 90 degrees in its angle. Okay. The other ones are another way to draw arcs. If you know you need to have a arc that goes between this point, this corner, and this point, you click each of the subsequent points and it will create an arc between those 3 points. Again, I'm not too sure how useful the 3-point arc tool is, but it is available. And then this one, similar to the arc tool, the pie tool, the only difference between it and the arc tool is it draws the edges for you as you're, I didn't switch the tool. It draws in the straight lines for you, depending on the angle, once again, that you add in. So if I want that to be a 60-degree angle, I can just type the number 60 right now, and it'll adjust that arc. Or if I wanted it 90, once again, I can create a 90-degree pie shape. Okay, so those are the drawing tools, and most of anything you will create, at least in 2 dimensions, will be done using these tools. And that basically covers our 2-dimensional drawing tools. Okay, and the next bit that I would like to discuss are the editing tools, and those are directly below our drawing tools. So these are our editing tools here. So we have the first one in the upper left is the move tool, and as the name implies, if you click on an object and drag it around your scene, you can easily see that that's how you would move it. If you get too close to these coordinate squares on an object, it will try and rotate it for you. So you have to be careful to pay attention to that when you're moving something. The other thing I want to point out about moving, especially in SketchUp, is where you click on the object with the move tool becomes the kind of center point of that move. And this can really be a bit frustrating when working in 3D. So, and I'll give you an example. If we had a platform that we wanted this fellow here to be standing on, if I click and move it now, it's kind of hard to get him up on top of that surface, because where I clicked about where his knee is. So the cursor wants to snap to the point where I clicked on the object in the first place. If I were to click along the base of the object, for example at the bottom of his shoe, and then try that again, you can see that I can easily put him on top of that surface, because the center point of my move was based on his foot. Similarly, if I were to have used his glasses and then try that again, I move him down below the surface based on where I clicked on the object. So it's very important for you to keep that in mind when moving an object in SketchUp. Where you click on that object before you start to move it is critical. Okay, so again, if you stick to something on the bottom edge or something along those lines, depending on what it is that you're trying to align, that will make things much easier for you to navigate. Okay. The next tool that I would like to demonstrate, I'm going to quickly draw just a 2-dimensional object here. I'm going to get rid of our platform. So if I want to rotate an object, and I can get the rotate tool, it's directly below the move tool. If I need to rotate this on a certain angle, I can select that tool and click, and this one works with a series of clicks. So the first click becomes the rotation point about which something is rotated, and then the next one starts the rotation, and then you drag your mouse around until you've rotated it. Now, similar to the move tool, where you click on the object is critical to where it rotates, right? So if I'm just going to undo that for now to put it back so that it's lined up with our axes. If I want to make sure that I'm pivoting around the corner of this object, I'm going to move the cursor onto the corner. And you'll notice that just with every tool in SketchUp that you get feedback based on where you move your cursor along an object. So the endpoints will have a little green dot The edges will always have a little red square, and the midpoint of an edge will turn this cyan color. So it's helpful for you to remember that. Okay, so if I wanted to draw a line starting at the midpoint of one of these edges, if I were to move my pencil tool to the midpoint there and click and then drag it across to the other midpoint, I've now cut that surface in half. Anyway, getting back to our rotate tool, if I want to rotate this about the center of this rectangle, if I move my cursor to the midpoint of that line I just drew and click there as my beginning point, and then as I move my mouse away from that center point, you see I get this little black line that occasionally turns red or green. When it's red or green, what that means is it's aligned to the axes of the drawing. So if you'll notice over here, we've got a green line and a red line, as well as a blue line. The blue line representing our Z coordinates, or our up direction. The green is what we normally consider to be our Y axis, and our red is our X axis. Okay, so if I want to make sure that I start at an understandable location, I'm going to drag that out until I get either a red or a green dashed line. Click there, and then as I move my mouse around, you can see in the bottom right corner that the angle that I'm moving it is being fed back to me. And if I know I need to rotate it exactly 72 degrees, I can type in 72 and hit enter, and my object has now been rotated exactly 72 degrees from where it started. Okay, so that's the rotate tool, and that one can also take a little bit of time to get used to, simply because it involves a series of clicks, not just one or two clicks, and we can get used to that by try rotating a few different objects. And don't forget to look over here in the instructor palette, because it gives you a lot of information on the tool that you're using at any given time. Okay, and the last, or not the last, but the next tool that I'd like to talk about is the scale tool. So if I were to select an object that I want to scale, I just select this tool here, and when I do, you can see I get these little green boxes and a yellow outline around my object. And these become the kind of focus or the location of where you're scaling. So whenever you scale something, the corner or the box that you click on to drag from, you'll notice turns red, and the opposite box across the object also turns red. So what this is telling me is when I click and drag here, it's scaling it relative to the opposing red box, so that I can see where my scaling is coming from. So once again, if I take the corner box here, the opposing corner turns red. So when I drag this out, I'm kind of not locked, but it's using that opposite corner as an anchor, and that's how I know what I'm scaling to or from. Okay, so in 2 dimensions, this is pretty straightforward. If this were a 3-dimensional object, things get a little bit more complicated. So I'm just going to select all of these items here, and if I select the scale tool, now you see I get a lot more green boxes. So depending on which orientation that I want to scale it at, it will allow me to do it in 1 dimension, 2 dimensions, or all 3 dimensions. I can scale it. So if I want to scale it in 1 dimension, I need to pick the center point of a face, either this face, or this face. And when I do that, I am only scaling it in 1 direction. Okay. If I want to do it in 2 directions, then I need to choose the midpoint of an edge. And by doing that, I will scale it relative to the opposing corner, and I can, as I move my mouse around, I'm affecting the object in 2 dimensions, scale-wise. Okay. If I need to do all 3, I'm going to pick the corner, and you can see that I don't have any option to sort of distort the object. It just basically enlarges or shrinks the object based on all 3 dimensions, and also that only gives me a single value over here in my value box. But if I do similarly in the green scale, it tells me it's being scaled in the green scale. But if I do 2 corners along an edge, you can see that I get 2 scale factors, and it will tell me which axes that I'm scaling it around. Okay, so you might want to play around with that a little bit before you just start grabbing things and scaling them. Okay, so it's helpful if you need to just make something taller but you don't want to make it wider or longer. So you'll use a face for that, or you want it to be thinner but not shorter or fatter. Okay, so again, depending on which box you click on can greatly affect how you're scaling the object. The other thing to point out about the scaling tool is if I want to scale it about a center point as opposed to the opposing corner. So let's say I want to keep this object focused in the area where it is, but I don't mind if it gets taller and longer down and in all different directions. If I were to do this, it anchors it about the opposing corner. But if I hold down the control key, you can see that the square jumps to the center of the box, so that I'm actually scaling it about the center of the object, and that works if I hold down the control key for any of the faces. Okay, so even if it's in one direction, it scales it about the center point. Okay, so that's a good thing to keep in mind when scaling. And the last tool that I'm going to talk about for editing is the push-pull tool, and I won't be talking about these two until a later lesson, but the push-pull tool is the tool that has made SketchUp what it is. Okay, and what this tool does is it allows you to select a face and drag it to change the proportions or sizes or features of an object based on pushing or pulling that face. So if I were to have a smaller subdivision of that face, and I get the push-pull tool and click on that, you can see how I can quickly start altering an object with only a couple of lines added in, and quickly I can change the parameters of my object just by the way I have edges subdivided on my object. So by pushing on certain surfaces, you can see how this can easily be used to quickly model things in 3D. So this is a tool that you really want to get to understand quickly, because this is, as I mentioned, what makes SketchUp SketchUp and what makes it so powerful and easy at the same time. So the secret is, how do you subdivide the surface? If I were to draw a circle on this face and then use the push-pull tool, you can see how I'm quickly able to alter how this looks, and I can even go the other way through the object and create a deep hole that comes out the other side. So if I were to take that back to this surface, then it actually cuts a hole through my object, and you can see that like that. Okay, so the push-pull tool is a very powerful feature, and it's the easiest way to model anything in 3 dimensions so quickly. Now it does have some limits. So for example, I've created this hole through my object. If I tried to push this face past that hole, it doesn't want to let me. So it's going to stop when it gets to that edge, and you can see there's like a little bit of a ghost line that's formed by that surface touching, and now because I've sort of stuck it to that edge, I can no longer pull this surface. If I were to do that here, it would do the same thing, because now it's confused as to what it's expecting that you want it to do. Okay, so just keep that in mind when using the push-pull tool, that it'll only let you go so far. Similarly, on angles, you can only take it until you hit another edge, and then it usually will stop you like that. Now, once you've done that, you can often continue past it if it lets you. It doesn't want to let me this time, but occasionally you can keep going once you've hit a surface. Let's see what happens if I do this. I'm going to draw a little line across the top and push this down till I hit this surface, and now that it's connected to that hole, it won't let me. But anyway, you can play around with that tool and get familiar with it, because this is the most important tool in SketchUp. Okay, so that wraps up our editing tools, as well as having covered the drawing tools and the navigation tools in SketchUp. So I hope you enjoyed that. See you next time. Bye-bye.